The wind off Blackwater Bay carried the tang of salt and rotting seaweed into the city that evening, mingling with the ghostly echoes of laughter from the feast that had ended in horror. King's Landing was a place where joy and terror could sit side by side at the same table, where every breath smelled of ambition and every footstep carried the potential for betrayal. And so it was that only hours after King Joffrey Baratheon drew his final, gasping breath upon the dais at his own wedding feast, the capital sat in a stunned hush. In the Red Keep's torchlit corridors, flickering shadows danced against walls that had borne witness to generations of schemes. Death clung in the air, sharp and pungent. Guards patrolled in frantic circles, Lannister crimson mixing with the Tyrell green in knots of confusion. The king was gone. There was no simple remedy for that. But if any city could recover swiftly from the violent loss of its ruler, it was King's Landing, the core of power in the Seven Kingdoms, where opportunists were ever poised to snatch advantage from tragedy. Margaery Tyrell stood in her chambers, her deep brown hair unbound from the elaborate style it had worn during the wedding ceremony. She had dismissed her maids an hour ago and sat alone, her reflection in the polished surface of a mirror revealing a face etched with a terrible mixture of shock and calculation. She had been queen for less than a day. Now, the question of whether she was still queen at all burned behind her eyes. A widow once more, though not in the same way as with her first husband, Renly Baratheon. This time, she had walked straight into the jaws of the lion, and the lion had died, choking on poison rather than a dream wine-laced cough. A quiet rap on her door made her turn from the mirror. "Your Grace," came a soft voice from the other side. It was an old woman's voice, yet brimming with the steel that age only tempered further. Margaery rose, smoothed the front of her gown, still the color of fresh cream and stitched with golden roses, and moved to open the door. Standing there in the corridor, clad in a dark cloak and wearing a faintly sardonic smile, was Olenna Tyrell, her grandmother and the calculating matriarch of House Tyrell. Margaery stepped aside in silence, letting her grandmother sweep in. Olenna's eyes flicked about the room, ensuring they were unobserved. The door closed. For a moment, there were no words, only the heavy hush of possibility. "Well," Olenna said at last, "the city will be a hornet's nest soon. Cersei will not rest until she's flayed every servant who so much as poured wine near Joffrey's cup. If she had any reason to suspect us, she would not hesitate to see us burn. But I suspect, for now, she is too lost in her own mania to think clearly." Margaery's gaze fell to her hands. How can she suspect anything but foul play? The rumors about the cup alone will keep her screaming through the night. I had hardly time to taste a sip before Joffrey. Before he... She could hardly form the words. She could still see his face turning a hideous shade of purple, his desperate clawing at his throat. "Yes, yes," Olenna replied dryly. "He died. That's the gist of it. And now the realm will need a new king. Tommen is the next in line, though no one can forget about Myrcella Offin Dorne. But as for Tommen, he's a boy, impressionable, far easier to sway than Joffrey ever could have been. That's your chance, child." Margaery nodded, her eyes brimming with thoughts she had barely dared to speak. "Yes, that is my chance. But the question is what stands in our way. Cersei will want Tommen near her at all times. Tywin will want him to be a figurehead while he effectively rules. The power vacuum might allow other forces to rise as well. The city is filled with unrest." Olenna's gaze sharpened. "Unrest, yes. The small folk are uneasy. Joffrey's cruelty left them with battered pride and pockets turned inside out. They're hungry for a more just reign, perhaps hungry enough to heed a new kind of call. We Tyrells have the grain to feed the city, after all. That alone can buy a great deal of love. The trick is ensuring no one stabs you in the back while you're doling out the loaves." Margaery steeled herself, lifting her chin. A plan had been forming in the back of her mind ever since the wedding ended in chaos. This city also has its devout grandmother. The septs are swollen with worshippers every day, crying out for relief, for a queen who will protect the pious, for a better life than the one Joffrey gave them. With a single marriage, I bound myself to the crown, but I can do more. If I can harness the power of the faith, If the High Septon can be convinced to back me, not just for Tommen's sake but as a rightful protector of the city, perhaps House Tyrell can seize the advantage now while the Lannisters reel. Olenna pursed her lips. You speak of a dangerous game, dear. Rearming the Faith Militant, or encouraging them to do so, is not a move to be taken lightly. The Crown's ancestors stripped the Faith of its militant orders to keep them from interfering in matters of state. Restoring that power to them could be as risky for us as it is for the Lannisters. Margaery allowed a small, deliberate smile. Cersei wants to see me caged, if she can. Tywin Lannister wants everything for the Golden Lion. But if the Faith Militant stands on my side, if I swear my loyalty to the Seven openly, if I proclaim it's time for the Crown and the Faith to be joined, can the Lannisters muster the popular support to oppose me? The small folk are stirred by religious fervor more than by any house's Golden Lion or Golden Rose. And if I supply food to the masses, bread for their stomachs, devotion for their souls, maybe we can turn King's Landing against them. Olenna's silence was confirmation that she had at least considered the notion. It's dangerous, she repeated. But it might be the best way to ensure your position and House Tyrell's. You'll need cunning. You'll need the right contacts in the Sept to make sure the High Septon sees you as the rightful queen. And you'll need men, Margaery, men to keep you safe if the Lannisters realize what you're up to. Margaery's lips parted in a grin that showed more resolve than mirth. I won't be alone. I have my ladies, my foot in the door with the small folk, my father's men. And perhaps I have the memory of Renly, who was beloved by many. They still remember how the Tyrells joined him. If we move quickly, we can secure King's Landing before the Lannisters can regroup. The chaos will give me the advantage. Olenna regarded her granddaughter for a long moment. Then her tone softened. Very well, but make sure you don't show your hand too soon. The next hours are crucial. Tywin and Cersei will surely lock down the castle, place guards at Tommen's door. They'll look for threats everywhere. They'll call for Tyrion's head, perhaps. But none of that will matter if you have the support of the Faith and the swords of the city on your side. Margaery exhaled, a deliberate breath that stilled her heart. I know what I must do. She escorted her grandmother out, listening to Olenna's final words of warning. Then, drawing the hood of her cloak over her head, she left her chambers through a side door that led into a back passage, quietly descending into the bowels of the Red Keep. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the enormity of what she considered. She slipped into a courtyard in darkness, a single torch guttered by a gate. A Tyrell man-at-arms waited there, crest on his breastplate hidden beneath a plain cloak. When he spotted her, he bowed low, a quick nod that signaled the carriage was ready. Tonight, Margaery would leave the castle, traveling incognito to the Great September of Baelor. No time to wait, not when the momentum was hers to seize. Through torchlit streets she rode, the carriage rattling across cobblestone, accompanied by 2 guards in the livery of House Tyrell, who looked more like pilgrims under their cloaks. The small folk still stirred, for while the feast had ended, rumor and tragedy always drew them out. Whispers filled the gloom. Joffrey is dead. The boy king is gone. Poison took him. No one is safe. Some whispered that it was the imp who did it. Others pointed to Margaery as a sorceress. Still others murmured that the gods had sent a sign of retribution for a sinful king. She listened in silence, letting their words swirl. The carriage pressed on through winding streets until it came at last to the broad white steps of the Great September of Baelor, illuminated by moonlight and the flicker of the city's torches. The building loomed, a symbol of spiritual might, shining with a kind of austere beauty. Margaery stepped out of the carriage and signaled for her guards to wait. She ascended the steps alone, her hood shielding her face, though the handful of people milling about near the entrance cast glances at her. They did not yet recognize the new bride of King's Landing. Perhaps they were too lost in their own devotions, or perhaps they simply did not expect the Queen Widow to wander the city on such a night. She passed through the towering doors, her slippered steps echoing across marble floors. Candles burned in tall stands, flickering over the statues of the Seven. Her eyes swept over the grand hall, from the stranger's dark visage to the mother's gentle countenance. She felt a shiver as she walked deeper inside. Finally, a septon approached, head bowed. "Welcome, child. Are you seeking prayer at this late hour?" "I wish to speak with the High Septon," Margaery replied, keeping her voice quiet yet firm. The septon raised his head, catching a glimpse of her face. Recognition lit his eyes with surprise. "Oh, of course, Your Grace." He turned swiftly, leading her across the cavernous space, through a side door and down a corridor lined with mosaics. At the end of that corridor lay a small antechamber, in which a cluster of worshippers murmured in subdued conversation. One of them wore robes embroidered with delicate gold thread, a circlet in the shape of the seven-pointed star gleaming faintly atop his head. The High Septon. He turned as they approached. At the sight of Margaery, his brows rose in astonishment. "My lady, Your Grace?" He corrected himself, his voice trembling with confusion. "Should you not be in the Red Keep, mourning the loss of—" "We are all in mourning this night, Your Holiness," Margaery said, pulling back her hood. "But my heart brought me here. I am a devout daughter of the faith, and I could think of no better sanctuary in this moment of shock and sorrow." Her words were honeyed, but they carried a distinct weight. The High Septon's suspicion flickered across his lined features. The suddenness of her visit was no doubt alarming. "I see. Perhaps we might speak privately." He led her into a smaller prayer room lined with tall windows and tapestries depicting the seven. The door shut behind them. Candlelight revealed the tightness in Margaery's posture, but she stepped forward with royal composure. "Your Holiness, I come to you in this hour of turmoil, not merely for solace but to ask for guidance. Our king has been cruelly taken from us. The city will be in chaos, and the realm will look for answers. You do realize that many suspect foul play," the High Septon ventured gently. "Yet the gods reveal truths in their own time." She lowered her eyes in a show of humility. "Yes, I know. I cannot pretend to understand their will. But I do know that my place is to serve the people and the faith. The Crown's alliance with House Tyrell was meant to bring prosperity to King's Landing. Now, more than ever, we must ensure the city does not bleed further." He steepled his fingers. "You speak with great conviction, Your Grace, but I sense you have a request beyond spiritual comfort." She allowed a slow nod. "Yes, we stand on the precipice of anarchy, I fear. The Lannisters still have the king's younger brother, Tommen, as heir. Yet, in these uncertain times, I worry for the city's safety and for the safety of all who worship the Seven. You know how freely blood has been spilled in these streets. The small folk cry out for justice and succor, for the light of the Seven to guide them. But mere words may not suffice. The faith once had the capacity to protect its own, to serve as a beacon not just of hope but of strength. You know what I speak of." His eyes flickered. He understood well enough. "You speak of the faith Militant, the ancient order disbanded centuries ago by the Targaryens." She pressed her lips together, orchestrating a careful show of reluctance. "Indeed, it was dissolved because it threatened the power of kings. But these are different times. We live in a fractured realm, threatened by the violence that took King Joffrey. The faith must stand tall to protect the innocent. I believe the realm could be renewed if the faith is once again allowed to protect the people. Let the crown bestow upon the devoted the right to bear arms in service of the Seven." His expression was guarded, though undeniably interested. The Lannisters would never allow such a thing. Their hold on the throne depends on controlling all the swords in the realm. Margaery lowered her gaze, schooling her voice to a melodic hush. The Lannisters or the Queen Dowager Cersei may not welcome such a notion, but does that matter more than the people's needs? And if the new king, Tommen, endorses the reformation of the faith Militant, under the guidance of a queen who is devout and beloved, then who can dispute its legality? She paused meaningfully. "I would see to it that the faith is recognized for its rightful place, that the faith Militant is properly armed to keep order in the streets, to ensure pilgrims and small folk need not fear. My own house stands ready to supply the city with grain and resources to quell unrest. Think of the good that can be done, Your Holiness." The hungry can be fed, the wicked made to answer for their sins, all under the auspices of the Seven. He looked taken aback by the boldness of her words. For a moment, doubt crossed his features. Then, slowly, a fervor began to kindle in his eyes. If this is truly your will, if this is truly for the good of the faith. Margaery drew closer, her expression solemn and earnest. It is. I promise you, with the support of House Tyrell, I can ensure that the crown will approve. The city is ours to shape, but we must act soon, before chaos rules the streets. He closed his eyes, murmuring a soft prayer under his breath. When he opened them again, the tension in his expression had changed into something resolute. Then let it be so. I shall gather the most devout. We will be ready to step forward and reestablish what was lost so long ago. I trust you will see this done with wisdom and caution. If the Lannisters consider this a threat, there will be blood. A tremor of relief coursed through her, but her face remained composed. We do this for the Seven and for the people. I will not falter, Your Holiness. They parted in a hush of candles. Margaery left the sept with a new sense of possibility coiling in her chest. The faith militant would answer to her, if she could ensure Tommen's ascension moved swiftly, and if she could keep Cersei from interfering. She had no illusions about the path ahead. This was but the first step on a perilous road. But each step would build momentum. The Queen of Thorns had told her to be cunning, and cunning she would be. When the carriage rattled back through the moonlit streets, Margaery's gaze lingered on the silhouettes of rooftops, the glow of lanterns behind windows. She imagined each household waiting, bracing itself for the storm that would follow the king's death. She thought of how quickly rumor might become riot. But soon, if she had her way, the seven-pointed star would shine in every alley, carried by a new order of devout men with steel in hand. The city would come to see Margaery Tyrell as the queen who gave them bread when they were hungry, who gave them justice when they despaired of ever finding it, who gave them pious protectors when all they'd had was the brutality of gold-cloaked Lannister men. That was the promise she meant to make, and the promise she was determined to keep. The next day broke with a pallid sun hidden behind clouds, as though even the heavens were in mourning for the dead king. Or else they simply lurked in watchful silence, waiting to see how the players in this dangerous game would move. Cersei Lannister's first action was to seal off the Red Keep. No one was permitted to come or go without her approval. She demanded the city watch be doubled at the gates. The King's Guard were put on high alert. She railed at the council, calling for Tyrion's head, cursing anyone who might have had a hand in Joffrey's demise. Yet amid her shrill fury, Tywin Lannister's face remained inscrutable. The Lord of Casterly Rock stood at her side, but his mind was already racing ahead, formulating the next moves to protect the Lannister line. The boy is too young, Cersei insisted in a council meeting that morning, her voice echoing off stone walls. He must not leave my sight. Tommen must not be crowned until we have answers about Joffrey's death. I want Tyrion executed. He was the one who handed Joffrey the cup. I want Sansa Stark found. She fled, like a guilty rat if ever I saw one. Tywin placed a hand on her arm, a gentle but firm restraint. We will find them in time, but we must secure Tommen's position. The realm needs a king, and the people must see continuity. We will not wait. The official coronation can come later, but we shall declare him king now. The boy will be ours to shape. Cersei bristled, glancing around the table. Margaery sat there, face composed, eyes lowered in perfect mourning. Grand Maester Pycelle fussed with some parchments, as if the new king were a foregone conclusion. Oberyn Martell, present as one of the trial judges for Tyrion, watched with narrowed eyes, though he offered no direct comment. Prince Oberyn was too clever to show his hand just yet. Cersei's gaze flicked to Margaery. Her tone held a note of venom. And what of the Tyrells? My son has died and my brother stands accused. I cannot abide the notion that the Tyrell girl remains queen. She is queen of nothing now. Margaery raised her eyes, letting tears brimming on the lashes show clearly. I love Joffrey in the way a wife strives to love her husband, no matter his flaws. My house grieves with me, but we stand loyal to the throne, my lady. We will do whatever is necessary to see the transition is peaceful." Cersei let out a low laugh. "Loyal? We shall see. Your brother, Loras, has the ear of half the knights in this city. If I find any sign of betrayal—" Tywin lifted his voice, cold and precise. "Peace, Cersei. We have lost a king, and the city is unnerved. This is no time to quarrel amongst ourselves. The wedding was meant to unify House Lannister and House Tyrell. Let us not forget that. Margaery remains a daughter-in-law to the crown. She may very well become queen again if she marries Tommen in due time. It is still the best option to maintain this alliance." Cersei's eyes flashed, but she remained silent under the force of Tywin's gaze. Margaery inclined her head in a show of compliance, though beneath the table her hands gripped each other, knuckles turning white. She heard Tywin's words with a jolt of clarity. They still wished for her to marry Tommen, to keep the Tyrell grain flowing to the city, to keep the royal coffers from running dry. A strategic union for them, but also for her. She hid her budding triumph behind carefully arranged grief. The eating ended with the decision to announce Tommen as king by the next sunrise, in a public ceremony of sorts in the throne room. A hush of tension marked the council's dispersal. Margaery retired to her chambers, half expecting a Lannister guard to bar the way or search her for hidden poisons. But if suspicion lurked, it found no immediate outlet. Once within her rooms, Margaery wasted no time. She penned a note to her father, Lord Mace Tyrell, urging him to reinforce the city with a contingent of Tyrell soldiers under the pretense of ensuring stability in the aftermath of the king's death. Then she contacted the High Septon. By the hour of the owl, robed worshippers had begun drifting into King's Landing from the surrounding countryside. Men who had prayed and trained in secret. Men who believed wholeheartedly that the seven needed armed defenders. The seeds were being sown. Soon, there would be a new tide in the city's underbelly. The faith militant newly reborn. Her greatest fear was that the Lannisters would notice these gatherings, but the city was in such turmoil, with heads spinning from the fiasco of the wedding, that few paused to wonder at a sudden influx of pious men arriving to the Great September by twos and threes. If any gold cloaks questioned them, they said they were pilgrims come to mourn the king and pray for the realm. It helped that many of these men truly did exude devotion. It was not an army of cutthroats, but an assembly of true believers. The next morning, just as the city was waking, the ceremony in the throne room took place. An abbreviated affair, overshadowed by a sense of dread, it was still enough to make Tommen's status clear. He was declared King Tommen of the House Baratheon, first of his name. The small folk were informed by criers in the streets, but the cheers were noticeably muted. Not all had forgiven the Lannisters for Joffrey's cruelty. Some could not muster enthusiasm while the memory of the last king's corpse was still so fresh. Yet Margaery watched the ceremony with a measured calm. Tommen, a boy of 8, stood in front of the Iron Throne, dressed in regal finery, his round cheeks too innocent for the burden placed upon him. He cast anxious glances at his mother, who hovered at his side with a forced smile, and at his grandfather, who looked like carved granite. When his gaze found Margaery, it softened with a mixture of childish fondness and relief. He had liked her kindness from the moment they met, and she intended to use that warmth to her advantage. Outside the throne room, tension rippled. Lannister guards were posted at every corner, crossbows and spears at the ready. But even the thick plate of a Lannister man-at-arms could not shield them from the swirl of rumors in the halls. Tyrion had been imprisoned, awaiting trial for the king's murder. Sansa Stark had disappeared. Littlefinger was nowhere to be found. Some said poison had been hidden in the pie, others in the wine, others in some cruel trick. No one truly knew how to unravel the puzzle, but the loudest voices clamored for Tyrion's guilt. Meanwhile, Margaery's ladies carried hushed talk of movement within the city, of robed men gathering at dawn and dusk, bearing the seven-pointed star upon their garments. Night fell again. The next morning, Margaery was summoned to Cersei's presence. She found the Queen Dowager in a private solar, sipping wine in front of a window. The sun glinted off the golden threads in Cersei's gown, and the strong smell of sweet arbor red wafted through the air. Her eyes were rimmed with red not from tears alone but from the exhaustion that accompanied her ferocious anger. "You wish to speak with me, my lady?" Margaery asked softly, mindful to lower her gaze as she addressed Cersei, a show of deference calculated to avoid immediate confrontation. Cersei placed her goblet on a small table, the clink of metal against wood unnervingly sharp. "Yes, do sit." Margaery did as instructed, folding her hands in her lap. Silence reigned for a moment, broken only by the faint scuff of Cersei's slipper on the floor. She looked at Margaery with piercing green eyes that gleamed like polished jade. "My son is dead," she began, her voice unsteady. "They say Tyrion put the poison in his cup, but I do not believe for a moment that he acted alone. He may be clever, but he wouldn't dare do something so brazen without aid." Margaery remained motionless, forcing her heart to remain steady. "He is your brother." Perhaps his hatred of Joffrey's cruelty was enough for him to act alone. Cersei's lips twisted in a bitter imitation of a smile. "My brother is a vile creature, but not a fool. He knows how to weigh risk. And you, do you truly expect me to believe you had nothing to do with it? You have lost one husband already, and now another. How unfortunate that the men you wed seem to wind up dead." Margaery's composure faltered only slightly. "I have no control over the fates the gods weave, my lady. Joffrey died so suddenly. I was as shocked as any." Cersei's gaze pinned her. "Your house stands to gain from it, do you not? Tommen is more pliable, more easily controlled. Did you and your grandmother decide Joffrey was too difficult to manage? Did you slip some vile poison in his cup? And now the city stirs with rumors of the faith militant's revival. Men in robes carrying cudgels. I hear they gather in the September at odd hours, reciting old vows." Margaery's pulse quickened. So Cersei had begun to glean what was happening. She kept her face serene, though. "We Tyrells have no reason to kill the king. We were already wed, our alliance sealed. Tommen's kingship is a matter of law, not preference. As for the faith, I cannot speak to any rumors you've heard. The small folk are frightened. Perhaps they feel safer praying in large numbers." Cersei's voice dropped into a near hiss. "Do not think me a fool, girl. My father believes you are useful, but I see you for the schemer you are. If I find the slightest proof you had a hand in Joffrey's death, I will drag you through the streets in chains and feed you to the crows. Is that understood?" Margaery kept her voice as steady as she could. "I understand your anger. I have no desire to see further bloodshed. My house is loyal to your father, to Tommen, and to the crown. I want only peace and stability for the realm. If there is anything I can do to assuage your concerns." Cersei rose abruptly, snatching up her goblet once more. "You can stay out of my sight, that is what you can do. I have no more patience for your demure smiles and sweet words." Margaery bowed her head and slipped from the solar, leaving Cersei behind with her wine. A tension wound itself tighter in Margaery's chest. Cersei was no fool, and her rage was a formidable weapon that could ignite at the slightest provocation. The window for Margaery's plan was narrowing. She needed to act swiftly if she was to bring the faith militant fully into the city's life, and if she was to secure Tommen's betrothal before Cersei could sabotage the notion. That evening, Margaery arranged a meeting with her father and grandmother in her own chambers. Olenna arrived first, leaning on her cane, her eyes darting around the corridor to ensure no one overheard. Mace Tyrell arrived moments later, barrel-chested and dressed in a lavish doublet embroidered with golden roses. He looked flustered but determined. They barred the door, posted a guard outside, and spoke in hushed tones. Margaery wasted no time. "Father, have you arranged for your men to be stationed in the city?" Mace nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. Yes. 1,000 men have marched in, under the excuse of protecting the Tyrell holdings here, ensuring no riots break out. They're mostly camped near the city gates, but I've placed a small detachment close to the Great September as well, though we tried to keep that discreet." "Good," she breathed. "Now we must coordinate with the High Septon. We plan to reveal the newly reformed faith militant in a grand ceremony, one that will happen before Tommen's official coronation. The boy is only half-crowned in the eyes of the realm. The real crowning will be done with the blessing of the faith, and that is when we will declare the faith militant reinstated, by the will of the new king. Olenna raised a brow. Quite the spectacle that will be. And if the Lannisters do not approve? Margaery's expression hardened. They will not dare oppose it in public, not if the small folk and the High Septon all cheer. We must present it as a moral necessity. The small folk already despise Joffrey's cruelty. They want a sign that Tommen's reign will be different. This is that sign. Mace frowned. But how do we keep Cersei from meddling? She'll not stand idly by. A thin smile curved Margaery's lips. Tywin wants to keep us close. He'll push Cersei to accept this if it means the Tyrells stay loyal and continue feeding the city, funding the crown. At least for now. We only need the public support. After that, it will be done. Olenna clicked her tongue. The question is, what do we do with Tommen once the faith militant is empowered? Do we seize the boy, effectively keep him under our influence? Because if we let the Lannisters hold on to him, they might attempt to counter us. Margaery toyed with a loose thread on her sleeve, her mind drifting through a labyrinth of possibilities. We mustn't harm Tommen. He is the king, and the people will rally behind him, especially with the faith's endorsement. He must remain safe and appear content in our presence. I can ensure that. I know how to win his trust. He is just a boy who wants kindness. She paused, then continued with quiet intensity. But yes, we must isolate Cersei's influence. If Tommen is always at her side, she will poison him against me. We must secure him within the Red Keep under the watchful eyes of men loyal to us. Then, in a ceremony at the September, the High Septon will place the crown on his head, and I will stand by him as queen-to-be, with the newly rearmed faith militant flanking us. By that point, it will be too late for the Lannisters to object. Olenna nodded thoughtfully, though a faint tremor of concern pulled at her lips. And how do we keep Tywin from turning this into an open confrontation? He's no fool either. Margaery's eyes flashed. Tywin is a pragmatist. He sees power in alliances. He knows the importance of House Tyrell. He also knows the city is on the brink. A well-timed riot could kill half the gold cloaks. If the city's newly armed faith stands with me, not him, he would face chaos unlike anything since Maegor's time. Tywin will not want that. He'll negotiate a compromise. That gives us leverage. Mace puffed out his chest as though the plan appealed to his sense of grandeur. Yes, yes, and once Tommen is crowned properly with the faith's blessing, we can call ourselves protectors of the realm, true protectors. Olenna gave a curt laugh. If we can manage it without losing our heads. Let us not forget we are playing with wildfire here, quite literally, if Cersei decides to do something drastic. Silence prevailed for a time as each weighed the risks. Then Margaery took a measured breath. I must go to the High Septon and set the date. It must be soon, within a fortnight at most. The faith militant is not yet at full strength, but they have enough men to fill the streets. We Tyrells can fill the city with grain to win the love of the small folk. Cersei is consumed by her grief and anger. Tywin is busy preparing for Tyrion's trial. If we strike now, we can seize King's Landing. They parted with that agreement, each bearing tasks to finalize the plan. Over the next days, wagons of fresh bread and sacks of grain were distributed freely at Margaery's behest. Lines of hungry small folk queued at dawn for the Tyrell bounty, praising the generosity of Highgarden. Alongside this charitable outpouring came the presence of devout men from all corners of the Crownlands. They prayed in the streets, chanted outside taverns, and invoked the Seven to bless Queen Margaery for her kindness. Whispers spread that she truly cared for the people, that she was the realm's best hope for a queen who knew mercy. The Lannister soldiers on the city walls looked on warily as more men in rough-spun robes paraded into the Great September each day. A few scuffles broke out between gold cloaks and these devout newcomers, but the men of the faith endured the jeers and threats with calm composure, kneeling in prayer and citing the star as their shield. Word trickled back to the Red Keep, But with no official edict from the king to turn these pilgrims away, the guards could do little besides watch. Tywin might have taken more decisive action had it not been for the gnawing sense that the city might erupt in riots if the faith were attacked. Meanwhile, Margaery made sure to spend time with Tommen. She coaxed him to share his fears, gently reassuring him that he would be a kind and just king, beloved by his people. She gifted him with a small kitten from the Red Keep's scullery cat's litter, claiming the boy needed a companion. He named the kitten Ser Pounce, and Margaery watched the delight on Tommen's face as he played with the tiny creature. Cersei seethed, but for the moment, Tywin insisted Tommen be permitted to take comfort however he could. At last, the day for the grand ceremony arrived, a bright morning that bathed King's Landing in gentle sunlight. Margaery stirred early, her heart pounding like a smith's hammer. She dressed in a gown of ivory silk adorned with subtle golden roses, a more somber attire than one might expect for a celebration, but she intended to convey both reverence and regality. A half-cloak embroidered with the 7-pointed star lay folded on her bed. She would don it at the Great September to symbolize her devotion. Her father's men-at-arms awaited outside the Red Keep, lined up in columns. The Lannister guards looked uneasy, uncertain whether they should attempt to block the Tyrell forces. But Mace Tyrell had cleverly arranged for a formal escort of the king to the September. Cersei tried to protest that the king should not leave the Red Keep without her, that more Lannister men should accompany them, but Tywin overruled her. He wanted a display of unity. Tommen himself seemed excited, if a bit nervous. He wore a crown that was slightly too large for his young head, the crown that had once been Robert's, the stag horns and the gold shimmering in the sun. Margaery took his hand as they made their way down the steps of the Red Keep, while Cersei walked on his other side, lips pinched. Behind them came Tywin, his face an unreadable mask, and behind him more Lannisters and Tyrells, along with some high lords of the court. They processed through the streets in a carriage for the king, flanked by Tyrell knights in shining armor. The small folk gathered in droves, not quite cheering but certainly curious. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The new king is going to the September for the Seven's blessing. The Tyrell Queen Widow rides with him. Is he going to be properly crowned? Will the faith militant protect us now? As they approached the Great September of Baelor, the bells pealed a sonorous welcome. Tommen alighted from the carriage, glancing at Margaery with wide eyes. She squeezed his hand gently in reassurance. Together they ascended the steps. Lannister and Tyrell guards parted like two wary animals circling each other, forming an aisle. Overhead, the dome of the Great September shone, reflecting the bright sky. Inside, the space was filled with hundreds of the faithful. At the forefront stood the High Septon, flanked by men wearing light armor or robes with the 7-pointed star emblazoned upon them. They bore staves or cudgels, not swords, but Margaery knew steel was hidden beneath some of those robes. These were the newly anointed faith militant, still modest in number, but symbolic of the power that was about to be unveiled. Cersei's eyes swept the crowd, narrowing in alarm at the sight of so many armed worshippers. She shot a furious glance at Margaery, who responded with a serene smile, as though she had nothing to hide. Tywin stepped forward, voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "We come for the blessing of the Seven upon King Tommen, first of his name. May his reign bring peace and prosperity to Westeros." A chorus of amens rippled among the congregation. The High Septon raised his hands, a hush falling over all. Tommen stepped forward, crown balanced precariously. The High Septon spoke solemnly, his voice resonating with fervor. "Tommen of the House Baratheon, you stand before the Seven. Do you pledge to rule with wisdom and mercy, to uphold the laws of gods and men?" Tommen nodded, his small fingers clenched in his cloak. "I do. And do you accept the guidance of the faith, that the realm might walk in the light of the Seven?" "Yes," Tommen said, and his voice, though quiet, echoed across stone. "Then by the power vested in me by the Seven, I proclaim you king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. May your reign be guided by the father's wisdom, the mother's mercy, the warrior's courage, the maiden's innocence, the smith's labor, the crone's foresight, and the stranger's acceptance of all. He lifted a small container of holy oil and anointed Tommen's brow. Then, with a solemn gesture, he indicated for Tommen to kneel before the altar, which was draped in shimmering cloth. Margaery stepped forward, heart hammering, as the High Septon beckoned her with a subtle nod. The High Septon intoned, "House Tyrell has been bound to the crown by sacred matrimony. Though tragedy befell our late king, the realm finds hope anew in unity. Margaery Tyrell, do you pledge your support, your faith, and your devotion to King Tommen and to the Seven?" She let her voice ring out, pure and clear. "I do." A wave of murmurs spread through the gathered faithful. Eyes flickered to Cersei, whose face had gone rigid. But she did not interrupt. Tywin stood still as stone, calculating eyes giving nothing away. The High Septon continued, "Then let it be known that the faith stands ready to protect the king and queen. And in these troubled times, the faith militant shall be restored, with the blessing of his grace and the will of the Seven. No longer shall pious men be forced to stand aside while the innocent suffer. This day marks a new dawn for King's Landing." That was the moment. The robed men behind him stepped forward in unison, raising their staves. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some cheered, some gasped. Margaery glanced at Tommen. He looked uncertain, turning to Tywin and Cersei as if to ask if this was correct. But before anyone else could speak, Margaery moved gracefully to the boy's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your Grace," she said softly. "The people are afraid. Crime runs rampant. The city watch cannot be everywhere. Let these devout warriors help keep the peace, to ensure your people are safe." Tommen swallowed, then gave a tiny nod. "Why, yes," he managed. "Yes, I permit it." Uproar rippled through the hall. The High Septon signaled for calm, and the men in star-emblazoned attire returned to their places. If Cersei had been furious before, now she looked nearly apoplectic. Tywin stepped forward, ignoring her look of outrage, and spoke with the careful neutrality of a man who chooses words like daggers. "May the faith keep its vows," he said. "As the king has spoken, so shall it be done." The ceremony continued, but the revelation had already sunk in. The faith militant was now openly sanctioned. Margaery could feel the ripples of excitement and apprehension in equal measure. The throng of worshippers poured into the streets to share the news. The faith has returned, with the king's blessing. Margaery has pledged herself to the Seven. This changes everything. That night, the great September shimmered with candlelight as the faithful celebrated. Word spread quickly. Men of pious heart from the city's poorest neighborhoods lined up to offer themselves as lay swords for the faith. Many had been victims of thugs or extortion under Joffrey's reign and yearned for retribution. The small folks' love for Margaery grew. She had fed them, she had stood for them, and now she had given them protectors who knelt to the Seven rather than to the Lannisters' gold. But within the Red Keep, tension coiled like a viper ready to strike. Cersei stormed through the halls, her fury unleashed on servants and guards alike. Tywin summoned Margaery to his solar late in the evening. She entered to find him seated at a table, fingers steepled, eyes like pale green ice. He did not rise. He simply regarded her in silence until the door closed behind her. "You have achieved a masterstroke," he said at last, his tone measured and cold. "The faith's restoration. The people cheer your name. But do not imagine this will give you absolute power. House Lannister is not so easily undone." She inclined her head. "I have no wish to undo House Lannister. Our alliance stands, my lord. The king is crowned, and he has the protection he needs. Is that not what we all desire?" Tywin's nostrils flared. "I have ruled this realm in all but name for decades, girl. I know when I've been cornered by a ploy. You used the city's piety, fed them and flattered them, and then gave them a new armed force to adore. You have undermined the gold cloaks in their eyes. The people will look to the star, not the lion. You are brilliant, but do not mistake me for a man who will sit idle." Margaery forced a polite smile. "I have only done what is best for the realm. The city is calmer already. Fewer fights break out in the streets. My father's men provide additional security, and the faith militant covers what the gold cloaks cannot. Tywin eyed her. And so the Tyrell rose blooms. I warn you, be careful how many petals you unfurl at once, or you risk being cut down. We can remain allies in this new arrangement, but if you step too far, you will find no mercy from House Lannister. She inclined her head again, adopting a submissive posture that she hoped would soothe him. I understand, my lord. The king is young. He needs both our houses to guide him. Let us guide him together. He studied her for a long, silent moment. She could sense how thoroughly he weighed his next words, the cogs in his mind turning as he calculated risk, reward, the possibility of leaving the city in flames. At last he dipped his head. Very well. Your father's men can remain. The faith militant can remain. But your betrothal to Tommen will be formalized immediately to keep up appearances of unity. The wedding will take place as soon as decency allows after the mourning period. That is my condition. A ripple of triumph flickered behind her eyes, but she kept it masked. It will be an honor to wed his grace. Tywin dismissed her with a cold nod. Margaery departed, feeling her heart hammer. She had won a major victory. Cersei would despise it, but Tywin had acquiesced, seeing no better choice. The capital was a tinderbox. One spark of violence against the faith militant might ignite riots and bring the city crashing down. Tywin was far too pragmatic to risk that with so many other threats looming across Westeros. In the days that followed, the faith militant spread its influence through King's Landing. They patrolled markets, forcibly shutting down brothels that refused to pay heed to the Seven's moral strictures. They rooted out reported criminals, dragging them to the Great September for judgment. To many of the desperate and devout, they were champions of justice. But to the brothel keepers and less pious sorts, they were vigilantes, stirring trouble and sowing fear. Margaery recognized the dangers of letting their zeal run unchecked. She convened with the High Septon, urging caution, reminding him that the king himself must remain the supreme authority in the realm. The High Septon listened, but some among the faith militant had already tasted power and were eager to push further. Soon rumors reached the Red Keep that certain men of the faith militant had clashed with Lannister guards near Flea Bottom. A gold cloak had been harassing a washerwoman, or so the faith men claimed, so they stepped in. The altercation ended with 2 gold cloaks battered senseless and the faith men vanishing into the warrens of the slum. Tension soared. Cersei seized upon the incident as evidence that the faith was running amok. She demanded Tywin rein them in, demanded Margaery answer for it. But the small folk cheered the vigilantes, praising them for standing up to gold cloaks who were known to demand bribes or commit acts of cruelty. Margaery took the matter to Tommen, carefully guiding him through a public statement praising the faith for protecting the people but calling for restraint. Tywin had no choice but to endorse the statement publicly, though behind closed doors he threatened retribution if the faith dared harm another gold cloak. In the Great September, the High Septon preached cooperation between the crown and the faith, reminding the faithful that the king's will was paramount. For the moment, a fragile balance held. With each passing day, Margaery's popularity soared. Mothers came to see her with children in tow, praising the Tyrell bread that had eased their hunger. Thieves found themselves in new predicament. The gold cloaks lurked on one side, the cudgels of the faith militant on the other. But the zealots among the faith pressed for more reforms, urging the closure of taverns, the banishment of whores, the condemnation of any who had served the late king's cruelty. A line had to be drawn, and Margaery found herself walking a razor's edge. She wanted the people's loyalty without succumbing to the worst extremes of fanaticism. Quietly, she reached out to certain discreet agents in the city, spies or informants who had served House Tyrell or Renly's camp in earlier days. She instructed them to keep track of the more radical elements of the faith, to ensure any serious move against the crown was curbed. She needed the faith militant, but not so powerful that they could topple her. Amid this delicate maneuvering, the trial of Tyrion Lannister loomed. Cersei's attention turned sharply to that matter, channeling her fury into a single target. Margaery watched from a distance, sensing that if Tyrion were found guilty and executed, it might quell the Lannisters' thirst for revenge and give her a freer hand. But if Tyrion's trial ignited new conflict, particularly if Oberyn Martell involved himself, then the city could once again veer toward chaos. All the while, Tywin and Cersei began to realize that Margaery Tyrell was no idle participant. She was shaping King's Landing into something that suited her ends. Her vow to Tommen was more than a mere pledge of marriage. It was a vow to reorder the city's power structure. The Red Keep's corridors buzzed with speculation. Was the queen-to-be truly a saint, or was she a cunning manipulator hiding behind piety? In the midst of these rumors, Margaery appeared in public, dispensing alms at the Great September, standing in prayer with the High Septon, and visiting orphans in the city's ragged neighborhoods. Wherever she went, she wore the Tyrell rose subtly embroidered with the 7-pointed star, a dual symbol of her house and her faith. People bowed or reached out to touch her gown, as though she were a vessel of divinity. "You risk their adoration becoming worship," Olenna scolded her one afternoon, after Margaery returned from one such outing. "The faith might take it poorly if they suspect you of courting idol worship." Margaery gave a weary smile. "They worship the idea of hope, grandmother. They see me as a queen who might bring them peace after Joffrey's cruelty. I must tread carefully, I know. But for now, their hearts are with me, and that is a shield as powerful as any blade." Olenna nodded grudgingly. "Then keep your wits about you. The Lannisters are not finished with us yet." Indeed, tensions flared again when several more gold cloaks were found battered in an alleyway. Cersei railed that the faith had gone too far, but Margaery managed to broker a meeting between the High Septon and the commander of the gold cloaks, forcing them to vow cooperation in front of Tommen. Tywin merely watched from the side, stone-faced, as if measuring how soon the city might turn on itself. All the while, Margaery noticed that Cersei kept Tommen closer than ever, as though afraid Margaery might snatch him away. The boy king, for his part, showed increasing affection for Margaery, confiding in her that he was frightened of being a bad king. She assured him he would be a good and gentle ruler, winning his trust day by day. The next crucial turning point came on the eve of Tyrion's trial. Tension crackled in the Red Keep. Witnesses were gathered, rumors swirling about a dwarf who had threatened the king. Margaery remained outwardly neutral, though she privately doubted Tyrion was truly to blame. Olenna had made cryptic remarks about Joffrey's poison, but it served House Tyrell's interests to let the blame fall on Tyrion, so Margaery kept her silence. That night, as she prepared to retire, Margaery heard a sudden clamor in the courtyard below her window. She rushed to peer out and saw torches bobbing in the darkness, figures moving swiftly. Her father's men, joined by robed figures of the faith militant, were confronting a group of gold cloaks. Shouts rang out, metal clashed on stone. Somewhere, a man bellowed in pain. Her heart jumped. She quickly slipped into a cloak and hurried down the stairs, calling for her personal guards. The Red Keep's corridors were in chaos. Lannister guards sprinted to and fro. Tyrell men formed ranks, unsure what had sparked the altercation. When she emerged into the courtyard, the torchlight revealed 2 gold cloaks sprawled on the ground, one bloodied and unmoving, the other moaning in pain. A cluster of faith militant men stood over them, while Mace Tyrell tried to keep the peace. Cersei appeared on the balcony above, hair disheveled, face contorted with wrath. "What is this treachery?" she shrieked. "Are the Tyrells murdering the king's own guards?" Margaery forced her voice steady, calling out, "What happened?" One of the faith militant men stepped forward, staff in hand. "They tried to enter the Sept's sacred space uninvited, seeking to arrest one of our brothers for a crime he did not commit. We intervened, tempers flared. The gold cloaks drew their blades. We had no choice." Cersei's face twisted. "No choice but to strike them down in the king's own castle? We'll see your heads mounted on spikes. Every one of you zealots." Margaery raised her hands, trying to project calm authority. "My lady, please. This conflict serves no one. We will see the truth of what happened. If your men drew steel first, it is they who should answer for it." Cersei spat. Your whoreson zealots have taken it upon themselves to police this city. That was never the intent of the king's blessing. You have twisted everything, Margaery. I will not allow it to continue." Mace Tyrell hurried to stand by his daughter, urging Cersei to remain calm, but the Queen Dowager would have none of it. She stormed from the balcony, bellowing orders to the gold cloaks to arrest the Faith Militant men. This time, Mace's knights formed a protective line, demanding that no one be taken until the king could hear the matter. In the swirl of panic and anger, Margaery realized the tenuous peace was on the verge of unraveling. She found a guard she recognized and told him to summon Tommen at once. They needed the king to quell the conflict. Minutes later, Tommen arrived, his night clothes hastily replaced by a simple tunic, face pale with confusion. Cersei clutched his arm, pointing at the wounded gold cloaks. "Look at what they did, my sweet. These so-called Faith Militant. They are out of control. We must have them arrested, executed if need be, or they will tear your city apart." Tommen looked at Margaery, torn between his mother's fury and his budding trust in his betrothed. Margaery stepped forward, voice gentle. "Your Grace, there was a misunderstanding. The Faith Militant protect the innocent. If these gold cloaks drew steel first, they bear blame. We must investigate fairly." Cersei hissed. "They kill with impunity and hide behind the Seven. They are faithless thugs. Are you so blind?" Before Tommen could speak, Tywin arrived, resplendent in a crimson cloak despite the late hour. He surveyed the scene with undisguised impatience. "Enough," he commanded in a voice that brooked no defiance. "We will not settle this by screaming in the courtyard. The king shall hear all sides in the throne room now." Reluctantly, the parties moved inside, the tension so thick Margaery could taste the bitterness on her tongue. The men of the Faith Militant glowered at the gold cloaks, who glowered right back. Margaery took Tommen's arm, guiding him gently, while Cersei prowled on his other side, hand gripping his shoulder as if to chain him to her. In the throne room, torches blazed and the uneasy crowd formed two factions. Lannister men to one side, Tyrell men and Faith Militant to the other. Tommen climbed the dais and sat on the Iron Throne, the huge metal seat dwarfing him. Tywin and Cersei stood behind him, each determined to steer the outcome. Margaery stood off to the side but near the dais, her presence a reminder of the city's new reality. Tywin spoke in a calm, incisive tone. "Explain yourselves," he said to the Faith Militant men, who knelt before the throne. One of them, a tall man with pious eyes, explained that they had only attempted to protect a brother who was unfairly accused of theft. The gold cloaks had brandished swords, so they defended themselves. The captain of the gold cloaks spat out a different story, insisting that the Faith men had refused a lawful search, had threatened them with violence first. The accounts clashed, no clear witness to confirm one or the other. Cersei seized the moment. "They attacked the crown soldiers. That is treason. We must strip them of arms and throw them in the black cells." Tommen shifted uncomfortably on the throne. "But they were only defending their brother, if that's true." Tywin leaned in. "Your Grace, we must not allow chaos. If we give the Faith license to strike at your own guards, we invite anarchy." Margaery found her opening. She moved gracefully forward. "My king, if we punish the Faith Militant without proof, we risk a riot in the streets. The people love the new order. We must show fairness, not partiality to one side. Let us hold a formal inquiry. Keep the men confined under watch, yes, but do not brand them traitors until the truth is found. Show your people that you are a just king." Tommen looked from Margaery to Tywin, then to his mother. Cersei's eyes burned with hatred, but Tywin's face remained stone. At last, Tywin gave a small nod, signaling that a compromise might be acceptable. Tommen, relieved, cleared his throat. "Yes, a formal inquiry. Confine the men from both sides to keep the peace. No one is declared guilty yet." A wave of murmurs spread through the hall. The Faith Militant men bowed solemnly, while the gold cloaks stood stiffly, frustration etched on their faces. The king had spoken. With Tywin's silent acceptance, it was decided. Cersei fumed, but she could not openly defy her father and the king. The men were led away, carefully separated so as not to spark another clash. Margaery watched the tension recede marginally from the room. They had avoided open bloodshed, but only just. If such incidents continued, the city would erupt. As the crowd dispersed, Tywin approached Margaery. "You see now, do you not, the danger of this arrangement?" She returned his gaze coolly. "Chaos often accompanies change. We must guide it, lest it guide us." Tywin's mouth set in a grim line. "Ensure you do guide it, or we will do it for you, and the results will not be to your liking." She said nothing, meeting his gaze with equal resolve. Outside, the night was still thick. The flicker of torches along the Red Keep's walls underscored a truth none could deny. The city was not yet secure, and the lines between royal authority and religious fervor had blurred. Margaery returned to her chambers, feeling a sense of both accomplishment and dread. She had made great strides in seizing King's Landing, forging a new power base with the Faith Militant at her side. Yet the cost was growing. One wrong step, one spark of conflict, could bring Lannister wrath crashing down, or could unleash a wave of zealous bloodshed from the Faith. She stood by her window, gazing at the towers of the Great September in the distance, luminous beneath the moonlight. She recalled Renly's laugh, long ago, the illusions she once held about chivalry and gentleness. That world was gone. She lived in one shaped by cunning, poised on the edge of a blade. But she had chosen this path and would see it through. For her house, for her own ambition, and perhaps distantly, for the dream of a gentler realm than the one Joffrey had terrorized. Somewhere a raven would fly, messages would be sent, allies in distant corners might stir, enemies might plot. The queen-to-be of the Seven Kingdoms had cast her lot with steel-willed septons and an army of pious men. She had defied the proudest family in Westeros to do so. Now, in the hush of the night, she whispered a silent prayer to the Seven for their guidance and braced herself for the battles, both hidden and open, that lay ahead. When she finally closed her eyes, dreams came swiftly, filled with the clang of swords and the roar of a cheering crowd as she stood triumphant beside a child king, a golden rose in one hand and the seven-pointed star in the other. But beyond the cheering, she glimpsed shadows, Cersei's hateful glare, Tywin's calculating stare, the flicker of wildfire in the distance, and wondered whether she had lit a candle that might one day burn the realm to ash. Yet all she could do now was press onward. In King's Landing, only those who moved boldly through the dark survived to see the dawn. And Margaery Tyrell intended to see many dawns, crowned in a rising sun of her own making. Margaery sat alone in her chambers, staring into the pale glow of a single candle. Outside the window, the night was hushed, yet she knew the city beneath that hush simmered with tension. The courtyard fracas between the Faith Militant and the Gold Cloaks still echoed in her mind, and even hours later, she could not push aside the sense that a fuse had been lit. How long before the next spark ignited the tinder scattered about King's Landing? She breathed slowly, letting the candle's flicker guide her into a calm. Then, with care, she blew it out. Darkness settled, punctuated only by moonlight filtering through the narrow windows. She stood and crossed to the small hearth, where embers glowed softly. With a delicate hand, she raked them into a quiet swirl, reminding herself that power could be stoked like coals, built gradually until it flamed, and that each flame needed tending, lest it blaze out of control. As the last red glimmers faded, she returned to her bed, though she expected no gentle sleep. Every footstep in the corridor made her listen sharply, alert for an emergency call from her father's men or FO. Are Cersei's guard marching to arrest her on some trumped-up charge? But the night passed in uneven snatches of half-sleep, and morning arrived without any new crisis. In the dawn's gray light, Margaery dressed in simple silks. Morning garb was still the official style at court after Joffrey's death, so she chose muted blues and silver. She braided her hair loosely, conscious that the small folk admired her for her seeming humility and gentle grace. That was a purposeful image, a queen-to-be who bore no arrogance but instead carried hope wherever she walked. When she ventured into the Red Keep's corridors, the hush of tension had grown more pronounced. Household knights muttered among themselves. Servants scurried past with eyes averted, sensing hostility crackling in the air. From behind one door, she heard a burst of anger, Cersei's voice, rising in fury. Then the door slammed, leaving only echoes of her rage. Margaery kept her chin high and nodded at the guards who opened the doors to the council chambers. Today, the trial of Tyrion Lannister was set to begin, and the atmosphere was that of a city about to watch a spectacle both grim and potentially explosive. She wondered if the day would bring resolution or simply feed the city's frenzy. Inside the council hall, she found Tywin in discussion with Oberyn Martell and Mace Tyrell. They stood around a large table strewn with documents. Cersei stood off to one side, silent but visibly on edge. Kevan Lannister and Pycelle were absent, likely attending last-minute arrangements for the trial. Margaery approached, waiting to be acknowledged. Tywin turned, eyes cool as marble. "Lady Margaery," he said, using neither "Your Grace" nor any affectionate courtesy. "We were discussing the security for the trial today. As you can imagine, we wish to avoid a riot if the verdict meets with resistance." Oberyn Martell's dark eyes flicked toward Margaery with mild curiosity. He spoke with a lilt of dry humor. "Resistance from whom, I wonder? Most would see a Lannister in chains and think it a fine day's sight." "You speak treason," Cersei snarled. "He is my brother." "He is also the accused," Oberyn countered. "And I stand as one of the judges. I would call it justice, not treason." Tywin cut them both short. "We do not gather to argue. Lord Mace will supply an honor guard to stand alongside the gold cloaks in the throne room. Prince Oberyn, you and your men will be present as well. This arrangement ensures no single faction dominates." Margaery gave a small nod, glancing at her father. Mace puffed out his chest with self-satisfaction. "Yes, indeed. I have a company of knights who will stand by. It should be enough to keep order, my lord." Cersei's voice hardened. "And what of these faith militant zealots?" She turned her glare on Margaery. "Are they to barge into the throne room as well? Perhaps they fancy themselves the king's ultimate protectors." Margaery lowered her eyes as if in concern. "They will obey the king's edicts. If his grace requests they remain outside, they will remain outside. The High Septon has no wish for discord, my lady. Because you speak for him, no doubt." Cersei shot back, bitterness dripping from her tone. Margaery maintained her serene composure. "I speak for the king's will, nothing more. And for peace in the city, if we can manage it." Oberyn's gaze flicked between the two women, an amused glint in his eyes. "The question is whether peace can be managed at all." Tywin let out a slow breath. "The trial begins at midday. I trust you can all maintain civility at least until a verdict is reached." His stare settled heavily on his daughter, as if to warn her. Then he turned away, dismissing them with a curt nod. "We reconvene in the throne room at noon." Cersei left first, her skirts brushing the floor with a whisper of pent-up fury. Mace Tyrell followed, warbling something about the dais arrangement. Oberyn wandered out soon after. Margaery lingered a moment longer, meeting Tywin's gaze, measuring the tension in his eyes. She spoke softly. "My lord, a final word. The faith grows restless. We must not appear to be persecuting them. The city is calmer than it was under Joffrey, but we stand on a razor's edge." Tywin's voice was icy. "I am aware. Keep your zealots in check. If they disrupt this trial or so much as raise a finger against another gold cloak without just cause, I will have heads on pikes, no matter whose authority they claim to wield." Margaery inclined her head. "As you say, Lord Tywin." She turned and left, each step echoing through the corridors. Her father's knights stood waiting in the courtyard, and she instructed them on how to array themselves in the throne room. Politely, not aggressively, but with enough presence to dissuade intimidation by the gold cloaks. She felt the weight of Tywin's threat on her shoulders. If the faith caused another scandal today, the Lannisters might lash out violently, and all her careful plotting could unravel. She needed the Faith Militant's cooperation and control. She took a carriage to the Great September, accompanied by 2 of her own guards. The streets were uneasy, with knots of city folk huddled in corners, whispering about the dwarf's trial. Some believed Tyrion was innocent. Others insisted they had seen him pour poison into Joffrey's cup. Most seemed simply hungry for spectacle, as the people of King's Landing had always been. When Margaery arrived at the September, she found the High Septon in the main sanctuary, kneeling in front of the towering statue of the father. He rose upon seeing her, expression expectant. Around them, robed figures muttered prayers. The faint scent of incense hung in the air. She approached quietly. "Your Holiness, the trial begins at midday. I come to request that the Faith Militant remain outside the Red Keep during the proceedings. The king desires no further incidents." He studied her face. "I understand. But many of our faithful bristle at how the gold cloaks treat them. Rumors of last night's fight have traveled far. They ask why the Faith Militant is not permitted to defend itself." Margaery kept her voice low. "If they commit any violence within the keep, Tywin Lannister will declare them outlaws. We cannot afford that. We have come so far. We must not tear open the city's wounds. Please, instruct your men to maintain their patrols in the city, but not to approach the castle unless I send word that they are needed." A flicker of concern passed over the High Septon's features. "I will do as you ask, my lady. But know that some of the younger, more fervent sparrows do not heed my cautions so readily. They believe themselves guided by the warrior and the father alike." She nodded, feeling the tension coil tighter. "I understand, but we must lead them, not let them lead us." He murmured a prayer for wisdom, then gestured for one of the brothers to approach. Swiftly, the High Septon relayed Margaery's request, telling the brother to spread word that the Red Keep was off-limits. Margaery, satisfied for the moment, offered a silent thanks to the mother for soothing the faith's zeal. She prayed it would be enough. As she departed the September, a light drizzle began to fall, turning the city's dust into a thin slurry beneath carriage wheels. She watched the muddy streets pass by, feeling each jolt as a reminder of how precarious her position was. There was no easy path to keep the Faith and the Lannisters both placated. Yet for the good of her house, and for her own claim to queenship, she had to succeed. When she reached the Red Keep, the outer ward was busy with arrivals. Lords and ladies streamed through the gates, keen not to miss the momentous spectacle. The infamous Tyrion Lannister on trial for the murder of the king. Courtiers murmured in hushed excitement as they made their way toward the throne room. Margaery glimpsed the sigils of various houses, Rosby, Hayford, even a few minor lords from the Crownlands. She also caught sight of Oberyn Martell's retinue in bright Dornish attire, a splash of color amid the gloom. She ascended the stairs and stepped into the throne room, which was lit by torches along every pillar. At the far end rose the Iron Throne, with Tommen perched upon it. He looked small, dwarfed by the swords that had once belonged to Aegon's enemies, but tried to straighten his shoulders as though he could show confidence. On his right side stood Cersei, clad in black with gold filigree at her sleeves. On his left was Tywin, in red and gold, face as severe as stone. A dais had been placed before the throne for the 3 judges, Tywin, Prince Oberyn, and Mace Tyrell, though Tywin was currently at Tommen's side and would join the dais once the trial began. The galleries were already packed with onlookers, among them lords, ladies, and knights who had found a vantage point to watch. A ring of gold cloaks stood around the perimeter. Amid them, Margaery noted a cluster of her father's knights, signifying the Tyrell presence. Their eyes flicked between the crowd and the dais, watchful for trouble. She slipped into a seat in the front row of onlookers, near the dais that was reserved for the royal family, though she was no longer strictly part of it until her marriage to Tommen was solemnized. Still, nobody challenged her right to sit there. Her father, Mace, already stood near his seat of judgment, fussing with the collar of his tunic. Oberyn lounged beside him, arms folded, wearing a faint, mocking smile as though the entire affair was a game he intended to enjoy. At a nod from Tywin, the herald stepped forward and banged his staff on the floor. All rise in the presence of King Tommen, first of his name. Let the accused be brought forth. A hush fell. Tyrion Lannister, hands shackled, was escorted in by 2 gold cloaks. He walked with his chin raised, though a flicker of tension haunted his mismatched eyes. His clothing was fine but subdued, a dark doublet with subtle lion embroidery that seemed a sad echo of the house he stood accused of betraying. Margaery studied his face. Tyrion was clearly weighed down by the knowledge that nearly everyone here, especially Cersei, wanted him to hang. He was led to a wooden dock set at the center of the throne room. The herald recited the charges: murdering the king by poison, regicide, and high treason against the crown. Tyrion listened with a tight jaw, saying nothing, while the herald's voice rang across the hall. When the list of charges ended, Tywin crossed to the dais and took his seat between Oberyn and Mace, the embodiment of rigid authority. "Let the trial begin," Tywin announced. "We will hear the crown's evidence first." "Who speaks for the crown?" Cersei moved forward. "I do," she said, a sharpness in her tone that made even the torches seem to flicker in caution. "I call upon those who were present at the wedding feast to testify." And so the testimonies began. Servants who had carried the chalice claimed Tyrion had handled the cup, refilling it at one point. A singer recalled seeing Tyrion trade words with Joffrey, though it was hardly news that they had bickered. Pycelle rattled off a list of poisons that might have been used. Margaery watched Tyrion's face as witness after witness either pinned suspicion on him or twisted half-truths under Cersei's guiding hand. He wore a mask of contempt and exasperation. At length, Oberyn Martell interjected questions, some relevant, some sardonic, probing for inconsistencies. Mace Tyrell, for his part, simply nodded along to Cersei's statements, only occasionally clearing his throat to ask a mild question. Tywin kept proceedings orderly, cutting off tangents and demanding brevity. Through it all, the court murmured and gawked. Many pairs of eyes slid to Margaery, as though seeking her reaction to each fresh condemnation of her royal husband's supposed killer. But she was careful to keep her expression neutral, neither condemning Tyrion nor offering him any hint of sympathy. When midday light streamed in through the high windows, Cersei concluded her evidence by having Pycelle present a strangler's stone, a small black crystal said to cause choking. Pycelle insisted the crystal had been found among Tyrion's personal effects, though Oberyn's skeptical glance suggested he believed it might have been planted. Still, the show of the black crystal caused a stir of disquiet. Tywin turned his cool gaze upon Tyrion. "The crown has presented its case. Have you aught to say in your defense, imp?" Tyrion's shackles rattled slightly as he shifted. He spoke in a crisp voice that carried surprisingly well. "Only that I loved no one in my family except my brother Jaime. I had no cause to kill Joffrey that day of all days, publicly, in the midst of 1,000 witnesses, with a method guaranteed to point blame at me. If I had intended to murder my nephew, I would not have done so in such a spectacularly idiotic manner." A flutter of laughter rose from somewhere in the crowd, swiftly silenced by a glare from Tywin. Tyrion continued, "I have been made a scapegoat. The poison was put in the chalice or the pie by someone else, for reasons that have nothing to do with me. Look to the Tyrells if you will, or to Littlefinger who was suspiciously absent. Anyone with cunning might have arranged it more cleverly than I. But believe what you will, this trial is a farce." Cersei bristled, eyes blazing. "You see how he spouts nonsense. He tries to cast blame on all, so none stands out." Tyrion smirked at her. "Better nonsense than a lie. My sister's hatred for me is well known. Let the court see. She wants my head, never mind the truth." Tywin banged his staff. "Order." He exhaled through his nose and looked to Oberyn and Mace in turn. "We shall recess briefly to confer before rendering a verdict. Bailiffs, escort the accused to the antechamber." A hush fell as the gold cloaks led Tyrion away. The crowd began murmuring at once, speculating on whether the dwarf would live or die. Mace and Oberyn left the dais to follow Tywin into a side room, presumably to discuss the outcome. Cersei glided toward the far side of the hall, flanked by 2 guards. Margaery remained seated, her heart an odd mixture of tension and curiosity. She knew that if Tyrion were found guilty, Cersei would press for immediate execution. The small folk might see it as justice, or they might see it as confirmation that the Lannisters always devoured their own in pursuit of power. Either way, the verdict might quell the question of Joffrey's murder. It might also stoke new resentments. Margaery was not entirely sure which outcome would best serve her. Tyrion was an inconvenience, a man cunning enough to threaten her strategies if he survived and managed to manipulate the realm again. Yet punishing him might strengthen Cersei's position in the short term. Minutes passed in charged silence. At last, the side door opened, and Tywin emerged with Oberyn and Mace behind him. All three judges resumed their seats on the dais. A herald shouted for silence, and the crowd stilled in anticipation. Tyrion was brought forward again, flanked by guards. He stood head high, face set. Tywin's voice resonated through the chamber. "We have weighed the evidence. The Council of Judges finds Tyrion Lannister guilty of regicide. Sentencing shall be pronounced immediately." An outburst rose from the spectators. Some gasps, some cheers, the clang of fists on wooden railing. Tyrion's face darkened, but a jolt of sardonic triumph shone in Oberyn's eyes, as though he had orchestrated this. Mace looked pompous, proud to have concluded a judgment that aligned him with the Lannisters. Tywin lifted a hand, commanding silence. Cersei stepped forward, all but smiling in triumph. Tyrion glared at her with undiluted hate. In the hush, Tywin continued, "The penalty for regicide is death. However," he paused deliberately, letting the words sink in. A wave of confusion rippled through the hall. Margaery sat straighter, tension coiled in her chest. Tyrion stared at his father, as though hardly daring to hope. Tywin's expression was unreadable. The king, in his mercy, may choose to commute that sentence. King Tommen, Tywin turned to the throne, where the boy sat with knuckles gripping the arms of the seat. The entire court shifted its gaze to the young king, who blinked in surprise. He looked at his grandfather in confusion, then at his mother, who nodded encouragingly, and at Margaery, who gave him a small, neutral tilt of the head. Tommen swallowed hard, glanced down at Tyrion, then spoke in a reedy voice that strained to fill the space. "Tyrion Lannister is my uncle," Tommen said. "But he has done me and my brother many wrongs, and yet I am not cruel, as my brother was sometimes called. I believe in the mother's mercy, so I will allow him a choice. He may take the black and live out his days on the wall, if he wishes, or he may face the headsman's sword." The hush became a shocked tumult. Take the black? The swirling rumor mill in the hall erupted into a wave of conversation. Some demanded Tyrion's head, others marveled at the king's leniency. Cersei's face fell, eyes wide with anger that her father and son had conspired behind her back. Yet she managed to mask it with a tight smile. Margaery suspected Tywin had orchestrated this carefully, as a means of avoiding the scandal of executing a Lannister, one who might have knowledge or cunning that could prove useful. On the dais, Tyrion let out a laugh, jagged and bitter. "The wall," he echoed, "might be preferable to dying in the dust. A place of criminals and outcasts, yes." He cast his gaze around the hall, settling it at last on his father. "Better black cloth than a red grave." Tywin did not respond, but his presence radiated finality. Tyrion turned to Tommen, looking at him with a mixture of pity and reluctant respect. "Very well, your grace. I will accept the king's mercy and take the black. 7 save me from the ice. But I will outlive you all, if only out of spite." Cersei's lips thinned, her eyes smoldering with repressed fury. But she could not gainsay the king without exposing her own powerlessness. The herald banged his staff again, calling for order. Tywin raised his hand. "Then let it be done. Tyrion Lannister shall depart for the wall within the fortnight, in the custody of a royal escort. The matter of King Joffrey's murder is concluded." Cersei, with the faintest trembling in her voice, added, "May the Father judge him harshly if he should ever break this sacred bond again." The trial ended in a swirl of relief, shock, and roiling undercurrents. The crowd began to disperse, filling the corridors with excited chatter. Mace Tyrell beamed, proud to have been part of such a grand spectacle. Oberyn simply looked amused. Margaery rose from her seat, heart pounding with the sense that the realm had just sidestepped a crisis. The city, hungry for a resolution, would have its scapegoat, yet no further blood would be spilled this day in the throne room. That, at least, might keep the Faith and the gold cloaks from clashing anew, unless, of course, the Faith viewed the king's act of mercy as an affront to justice. She slipped from the throne room, weaving through the corridors with her guards, heading for her chambers. But on the way, she encountered Cersei, who stood in an alcove with Jaime Lannister. They spoke in low, urgent voices. Jaime wore a look of quiet determination. Cersei's face was flushed with anger. Margaery paused, uncertain if she should pass by or retreat. Before she could decide, Cersei spotted her. "Go," she hissed at Jaime. "We'll speak later." Jaime gave Margaery a wary nod and strode off, leaving the two women alone. Cersei took 2 steps forward, eyes glittering. "I suppose you're pleased with yourself. Your father got his show of loyalty on that dais. Your precious boy king showed his mercy. And now my wretched brother is alive to spit in my face once more." Margaery kept her voice calm. "I had no hand in Tommen's decision. That was Lord Tywin's doing, and you know it." Cersei's lips curled in contempt. "You play coy so well, but I see your hand in everything that happens here. The bread you give to the small folk, the faith militant you've unleashed, the illusions of piety and gentleness that drape your shoulders like the mother's cloak. One day, that cloak will slip and reveal the viper beneath." Margaery met her gaze evenly. "I understand your anger, my lady, but this city needs stability. The trial is over, and so we can move forward, united in service to the king." Cersei gave a bitter laugh. "United? Yes, I see how well you unify the realm with your pious thugs. This was meant to be my victory, do you understand? Tyrion should be in a grave by now, and you stand by letting my father shape outcomes while you shape the city. Beware, Margaery Tyrell. You are not as untouchable as you think." Margaery stood tall. "Nor are you, my lady. If the king had chosen to execute Tyrion, the city might have raged with gossip and bloodshed. Perhaps the faith would have demanded more heads. Perhaps war in the streets. Tywin saw the outcome that would yield the least chaos, and no matter how you despise it, the realm is safer for it." Cersei's eyes widened with fury, but she held her tongue for an instant, as though something in Margaery's words pricked her own sense of caution. Then, with a last glare, she swept away, her gown trailing behind her like a dark stain on the polished floor. Margaery exhaled. Sometimes she felt pity for Cersei's plight. She had lost her son and seen her power chipped away by her father and by Margaery's own rising influence. But that pity lasted only a moment, replaced by steely resolve. She had to outmaneuver Cersei, or be devoured by her. That was the nature of court life in King's Landing. She continued on to her chambers, where she found her grandmother waiting. Olenna Tyrell sat by the window, a faint breeze stirring the edges of her wimple. She turned at Margaery's approach, her old eyes keen. "Well," Olenna said, "the imp lives. Did you expect that outcome?" Margaery sank into a chair, pressing a hand to her brow. "I wasn't sure what Tywin would do, but yes, it makes sense. Killing Tyrion would cause too many complications, especially with Oberyn Martell here, and the risk of strife within House Lannister itself." Olenna nodded. "Indeed, yet that outcome will set tongues wagging. Cersei will fume. Jaime is in an odd position, and the city wonders if the real poisoner remains hidden, perhaps among us." She paused, her voice growing dry. "Your plan to tame the faith grows riskier each day." Margaery met her gaze. "You counsel caution?" "I counsel victory," Olenna said bluntly. "Your father has done well to place knights here, but the Lannisters are still formidable. If they sense the faith militant has grown beyond your control, they'll strike. Tywin will not blink at crushing a zealot uprising." Margaery twined her fingers. "I've already asked the High Septon to keep his men from pushing too far. But some among them, sparrows as they call themselves, are quite fervent. They roam flea-bottom, dragging out criminals, thrashing drunkards. The small folk cheer them now, but that adoration can curdle quickly if a single innocent is harmed. I must rein them in. And do you think you can? Olenna asked, arching a brow. Religious fervor is a fickle beast. Margaery sat straighter. I can. I must. Tonight I'll go to the Great September. I'll speak with the High Septon and their leaders. We need to craft some guidelines. No more attacks on the gold cloaks, no more extrajudicial punishments. Everything must appear to flow from the king's justice. Olenna gave a soft snort. Very well, but be wary. Cersei's watchers may try to implicate you or the faith in some scandal. She'll want to see you fall from grace. Margaery left her grandmother with a sense of rising urgency. That evening, she dressed simply again, as if for a pious visit, then quietly slipped out of the Red Keep with a small escort. The sun was setting, painting the sky in dull oranges and purples. Fewer people were in the streets, but she still passed clusters of the poor, huddled near guttering lanterns. They nodded or bowed at her carriage, murmuring blessings or thanks for the bread she had distributed weeks past. As she neared the Great September, she saw a knot of robed faith militants standing at the foot of the grand marble steps, carrying staves with the seven-pointed star carved into the wood. They parted for her, bowing reverently. Inside, the vastness of the September was lit by hundreds of candles, their glow reflecting off polished marble floors and gilded domes. The High Septon waited near the altar, speaking with a handful of devout men. Upon seeing Margaery, he motioned for them to step aside. "Your Grace," he greeted, bowing low. She returned the bow with a graceful nod. "Your Holiness, I come to speak of the unrest in the city. We cannot have our faithful men beating gold cloaks in alleys. The Lannisters are beginning to see the faith as a threat, and they will not tolerate that indefinitely." He frowned. "I have tried to impress caution upon them, but many were beaten or extorted by the gold cloaks during Joffrey's reign. They feel emboldened to right old wrongs now that they bear the star. Their fervor is not easily quenched." Margaery placed a hand gently on his arm. "If we do not guide them wisely, the realm will collapse into bloodshed." The king gave his blessing to the faith militant to protect the innocent, not to wage war against the crown's own men. A cough behind them drew her attention. One of the robed men had approached, a tall fellow with close-cropped brown hair, a stern jaw and eyes alight with zeal. He wore a crude wooden star around his neck. "The gold cloaks are corrupt," he said bluntly. "We have found them harassing women, shaking down honest laborers for coin. The city has bled under their tyranny. Do you expect us to stand by?" Margaery recognized him as a man called Lancel, one of the faith's more vocal adherents of late, though she had not realized he had shaved off all his golden hair. The name triggered a memory. Lancel Lannister, a cousin to Cersei, rumored to have once been her lover. He had apparently taken up the path of the penitent with surprising fervor. "You are Lancel?" she asked softly. He bowed, an odd mixture of respect and defiance. "Yes, my lady. I have found the light of the Seven after many sins in service to House Lannister. I wish to atone, and to bring the city to righteousness." She studied him carefully, taking in the intensity etched on his face. "Righteousness must be tempered by wisdom, otherwise it becomes cruelty by another name." Lancel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Is it cruelty to punish the cruel? Joffrey had this city in chains. The gold cloaks carried out his vile commands. Now that the Seven allow us to bear arms, are we not called to exact justice?" The High Septon intervened gently. "We must remember the king's own authority. He too is blessed by the Seven. We cannot overshadow the monarchy. We must stand alongside it. What Lady Margaery says is true. There will be no peace if we overstep." Lancel's eyes flicked back and forth between them. Then he inhaled, as if forcibly calming himself. "I understand. Yet I cannot stand idle if I see a guard tormenting the weak. My conscience will not allow it." Margaery stepped closer, pitching her voice to a soothing cadence. "Nor should you. But there is a way to do this rightly. Gather evidence, bring it to the king or the justicars. We can punish those at fault without brawling in the streets. If you lead others in the faith militant by that example, we can maintain the trust of the realm. He studied her for a moment, conflict warring behind his eyes. Finally, he bowed his head, though his body radiated tension. I will speak with my brothers. But know this, if the Lannisters keep abusing power, we will stand in their way, as the warrior commands. Margaery let out a breath. That is your right, but do so with restraint. We must preserve unity, or this city will drown in blood. When Lancel withdrew, the High Septon gave Margaery an apologetic look. He is one of the more passionate recruits. His repentance is genuine, but he is haunted by the role he played in King Robert's demise, or so rumor says. She nodded. I see. Please do all you can to instill discipline among them. The king's wedding to me will occur soon, and we must make a show of harmony, not division. He promised to do his utmost, though she could sense the fragile nature of his hold on the more radical faithful. After conferring with a few other Septons about distributing more bread and maintaining charitable works in the city, she departed. The night air outside felt cooler, the drizzle gone. She walked down the steps under torchlight, her personal guards flanking her. Yet a strange hush lingered at the bottom of the steps, where half a dozen men in rough-spun robes knelt in prayer. They glanced up at her with solemn reverence. One reached out, fingers brushing her cloak. Bless you for your mercy, my lady," he whispered. She smiled gently, stepping back so as not to cause a scene. But the man rose, arms outstretched as if he might try to embrace her. Margaery's guards moved forward, halting him. A brief flicker of panic darted through her, but the man simply stared at her with shining eyes. "They say you are the new mother to the people, that you gave us bread when none else would. May the Seven shield you." Margaery forced a soft laugh. "I am but a servant of the Seven, nothing more. Please, pray for me as you would for anyone." He nodded, tears in his eyes. The guards guided him gently aside, and Margaery slipped into her carriage, unsettled. The near worshipful reaction of the small folk showed how easily they might place her on a pedestal. That adoration could prove a mighty shield, but also a dangerous one. Should anything tarnish her, the fall might be catastrophic. She returned to the Red Keep and found it quieter than usual. The trial had worn many courtiers out, and they slept in their chambers or had gone off to dine in small gatherings, buzzing with the day's events. She slipped up to her room, where she found a small piece of parchment tucked under her door. She frowned, picked it up, and opened it carefully. Inside, in neat script, was a single line: "We must speak. Come to my solar at sunrise. Tywin Lannister." Her heart gave a small lurch. She folded the note and breathed in, preparing her mind for another test. Tywin rarely summoned her privately, except for matters of significance. She prayed it would be a negotiation, not a threat of violence. Sleep came only in fragments that night. She lay awake, imagining all that Tywin might say. Perhaps he planned to push the wedding date sooner, or perhaps he intended to force her to cede power over the faith militant. She steeled herself for any possibility. At dawn, she rose and dressed in a subdued gown of grayish blue. She pinned back her hair, then made her way through the Red Keep's corridors to the Tower of the Hand, where Tywin kept his private quarters. She did not announce herself with guards. The note had implied confidentiality, and she guessed he would prefer privacy. When she arrived, a single Lannister guardsman let her in. Tywin stood by a window, arms crossed behind his back, gaze fixed on the awakening city below. The sky was a smeared pink, and the roofs of King's Landing glistened with dew. He turned at the sound of the door closing. "Lady Margaery," he said, voice clipped but not hostile. "Thank you for coming." She dipped her head. "Lord Tywin, how may I be of service?" He gestured for her to approach the table, where a carafe of wine and 2 cups sat waiting. She joined him, noticing a large map of the 7 kingdoms spread across the table's surface. Tiny carved lion tokens dotted the crownlands and the westerlands, while golden roses stood for Tyrell armies in the Reach and along the Rose Road. 7-pointed star tokens were newly placed around King's Landing, a sign he clearly tracked the Faith Militant's presence as well. He poured 2 cups of wine and handed her one. She accepted it, though her stomach churned too much to want a drink. Tywin sipped his own carefully, then spoke in a calm, measured tone. "We must discuss the future, yours, mine, the king's, and the city's. Yesterday's trial is over, but it raised questions about power in King's Landing. The Faith Militant is dangerously close to overshadowing the gold cloaks in the public eye. My daughter's hostility to your presence grows. And Tommen, dear boy though he is, remains malleable. If we continue down this path unchecked, the city will erupt." Margaery placed her wine on the table, stepping closer to the map. She could sense this was a pivotal moment. "I agree that tensions are high. I have tried to curb the faith's more extreme elements. But you must understand, my lord, the small folk see the Lannisters as tyrants who let Joffrey run amok. They crave a champion. The Faith Militant seems to answer that craving." Tywin nodded, expression cold. "All the more reason they must be integrated into the official apparatus of the crown, not remain an independent force. Did you think I would allow an armed, fanatic faction to roam without oversight?" She took a breath. "I've advised the High Septon to keep them under control, but they answer to their own beliefs, not to me alone. Even the High Septon cannot always reign in every zealot." Tywin's gaze flicked to the star tokens on the map. "Then we will officialize them, bring them into the king's authority, make them swear oaths to the crown in an open ceremony. If they refuse, they can be outlawed." Margaery felt alarm prickle. If Tywin demanded unconditional oaths, the faith's radicals might bristle. Some among them believe their loyalty to the Seven supersedes any loyalty to mortal kings. If we push too hard, we risk fracturing the alliance, inciting rebellion. A thin line formed on Tywin's lips. "That is why you will bring them to heel, quietly. Speak with the High Septon, prepare him. We will hold a grand ceremony on the same day as your wedding to Tommen. A wedding that will happen in a fortnight's time, I might add. The mourning period for Joffrey is more than enough." Her heart thumped. A fortnight. It was soon, yet not unexpected. "Very well. You would have the Faith Militant publicly swear service to the king during or immediately after the wedding." "That is precisely what I intend," Tywin said. "They will kneel before Tommen, proclaim themselves protectors of the realm under his command. In return, we will promise continued support for the faith, limited autonomy in policing heretics and criminals, but only under the crown's oversight. I will not allow them to become a power unto themselves." Margaery weighed his words. The notion made a certain sense. It would legitimize the faith's role, while also preventing them from turning into a lawless horde. And if it happened at the wedding, with half the realm's lords present, any radical faction that resisted might look like traitors. It was, in essence, a masterful stroke from Tywin. Harness the faith's popularity but keep it under the Lannister banner. Yet she also saw the opportunity. If she orchestrated this carefully, it could solidify her position as the beloved queen who had brokered unity. The faith might still look to her as their champion, even if publicly they swore fealty to Tommen. She gave a slow nod. "I can make the arrangements with the High Septon. The radicals will bark, but if the entire realm is gathered, if the king and all the lords stand in harmony with the faith, the radicals would isolate themselves if they refuse to bend. It may work." Tywin's eyes gleamed with cold approval. "Then see it done. Your father will take charge of wedding preparations, but the core of the ceremony, the oath swearing, will be a matter for you and the king." Margaery picked up the wine cup again, sipping it this time. The taste was rich and slightly spiced, an arbor vintage that reminded her of warm nights at Highgarden. When she lowered the cup, she met Tywin's gaze, steel to steel. "This alliance must hold, my lord. If House Lannister or House Tyrell tries to undermine the other, the realm will fracture." He nodded curtly. "Agreed. The seeds of discontent are everywhere. Stannis looms in the north, the Ironborn remain unruly, and across the sea, we hear whispers of Targaryen pretenders. Our enemies would revel in King's Landing tearing itself apart from within. She recalled the stories of Daenerys Targaryen, gathering unsullied and forging alliances far to the east. A remote threat for now, perhaps, but not one Tywin would ever dismiss. The realm was too fragile to survive a crippling internal conflict. She set the cup down gently. I will do as you ask. The wedding shall be in 2 weeks. The faith militant will kneel and pledge to Tommen. Let us hope it all proceeds without chaos. Tywin's gaze flicked to the dawn sky. Hope, yes, and preparation. I trust you will manage the High Septon. I will manage my daughter. Margaery's expression softened slightly. Is that possible, my lord? She is determined. A faint smirk touched Tywin's mouth. I have tamed more formidable beasts than my daughter. Let that be my concern. He turned back to the window, dismissing her without words. She inclined her head and left, exhaling once she was outside his solar. The plan was bold, but might be the only way to prevent the city from devouring itself. She felt a quiet urgency to speak with the High Septon at once and begin laying the groundwork for this grand unification. But that did not mean the radicals would simply lay down their arms and kneel. Precarious path lay ahead. In the days that followed, King's Landing bustled with preparations for the royal wedding, even as tensions simmered. The Gold Cloaks tried to reassert authority. The faith militant patrolled neighborhoods with newfound vigilance, and Margaery's father oversaw the lavish details of the wedding feast, determined to outshine even the ill-fated purple wedding that had ended Joffrey's life. Wagons of flowers, barrels of arbor wine, crates of spices, none were spared. Margaery found herself forced to balance these indulgences against the city's mood, still raw from Joffrey's cruelty and the trial's aftermath. She met with the High Septon regularly. He was amenable to the oath-swearing in principle, but anxious about how the more extreme faithful would react. Meanwhile, Lancel Lannister and other zealots preached in the streets, calling for purification of King's Landing. Some demanded the closure of more brothels, the purging of sinful influences. Margaery walked a narrow line, endorsing piety but cautioning that the city's economy and the king's peace depended on moderation. Cersei, for her part, retreated into an icy silence. She no longer confronted Margaery directly in the corridors but glowered from a distance, as if waiting for a chance to strike. Jaime was occasionally seen at her side, still wearing the white cloak of the Kingsguard, though rumors circulated that his devotion to Cersei was wavering. Tyrion remained locked in a tow, Ursel under guard, awaiting the day he would be sent north. Once or twice, Margaery glimpsed him in a window, staring at the city he would soon leave forever. Each passing day brought the wedding closer. Silk tents sprang up in the Red Keep's outer wards for visiting lords and ladies. Musicians and mummers arrived, eager for the coin to be earned at a royal celebration. The small folk whispered about the spectacle to come, praying this wedding would not end in blood as the last one had. Meanwhile, Margaery tried to quiet the memory of Joffrey's purpled face, choking on poison, even as she prepared to wed the younger boy who had inherited the crown. On the eve of the wedding, Margaery stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The sun dipped low, setting rooftops aflame with orange light. She felt a stirring of apprehension, remembering how Joffrey's wedding had seemed so opulent, so triumphant, only to dissolve into horror in the blink of an eye. Would tomorrow bring a new dawn, or a new tragedy? The looming oath-swearing ceremony with the faith militant would either unify King's Landing or drive a wedge too deep to mend. She clasped her hands. "Mother above, guide me," she whispered, unsure if she prayed to the actual goddess or simply to the memory of her own mother, who had taught her the value of compassion. She was playing a game of power, but she told herself it was also for the city's sake. The people deserved relief from fear and cruelty. She had glimpsed a new possibility for them, a realm not wholly ruled by terror. That night she slept fitfully. Visions flitted through her dreams. The great September bursting into flames, Tywin scowling as the faith militant roamed the streets, Cersei sneering from the shadows. In the final dream, she stood hand in hand with Tommen, a golden crown on her head, while the people chanted her name. Then the chanting turned to screams, and she awoke breathless in the darkness. Morning came. The Red Keep was alive with bustle before dawn. Servants scrambling to lay out floral arrangements, cooks preparing mountains of food, seamstresses making final alterations to Margaery's wedding gown. She bathed and dressed in a chamber warmed by braziers, her ladies fluttering around her, lacing her into a gown of pale gold that shimmered with subtle embroidery of roses and the seven-pointed star interwoven along the bodice. The effect was regal yet pious, a reflection of her dual role as both the Tyrell heir and a champion of the faith. Outside, trumpets blared in the courtyard. Lords arrived on foot, on horseback, in carriages. The wedding would take place in the Great September of Baelor, and from there, a grand procession would return to the Red Keep for the feast. Margaery's father came to fetch her, beaming with pride in a lavish doublet of forest green and gold. Olenna was there too, dressed in more muted greens, leaning on her cane. She fussed over Margaery's hair, adjusting a few tendrils. "You look radiant, child. Let that radiance blind your enemies." Margaery gave a small, shaky smile. "Let's pray it's enough." They descended to the courtyard, where a carriage adorned with green and gold roses waited to carry her. She climbed in, accompanied by her father and grandmother. The carriage rolled out of the Red Keep gates, joining a procession of Tyrell knights, gold cloaks, and a throng of well-wishers. The sky was clear, the sun bright, perfect weather for a wedding. She thought with a wry internal note that King's Landing's weather rarely matched the city's political climate. Crowds lined the streets, cheering as she passed, some earnestly, some out of habit. The faith militants stood in scattered knots, heads bowed respectfully, staves at rest. They had obeyed the command not to brandish arms during the wedding procession. Margaery glimpsed Lancel among them, his expression unreadable. Part of her worried about what would happen next. Would they truly kneel to the king in the sept, or had the radicals hatched a plan to force new demands? At the foot of the Great September, she alighted. Musicians played a stately tune as she climbed the marble steps. Inside, columns soared toward the dome, and a throng of lords, ladies, and knights parted to let her pass. Torches blazed, and the statues of the seven loomed. She saw Tommen waiting before the altar, dwarfed by the grandeur of the September, wearing a short cloak of crimson and gold. He smiled shyly when their eyes met. Near him stood Cersei and Tywin, both in formal attire. Cersei maintained an unreadable face, but Tywin offered the barest nod of acknowledgement. The High Septon, resplendent in robes of white and gold, raised his arms in welcome. The wedding ceremony began with the usual prayers and blessings. Vows were exchanged. Margaery felt Tommen's small hand trembling in hers. She squeezed gently, whispering reassurance. The High Septon anointed them with holy oils, placing a delicate crown on Margaery's head, fashioned to be lighter than the heavy Baratheon crown that Tommen wore. The hush in the September felt charged with relief as well as worry. No one dared forget what had happened at the last royal wedding here. When the final vow was spoken, the High Septon pronounced them man and wife, king and queen. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then louder as the tension slipped into something close to joy. Margaery inclined her head to Tommen, feeling a surge of compassion for his youth. How heavy the crown must weigh on him. She vowed silently that, if nothing else, she would try to ensure his gentler instincts were not crushed by the demands of kingship. Then came the moment Tywin had orchestrated. The High Septon turned from the newlyweds to address the congregation. His voice boomed with solemn authority. "We rejoice in this union, blessed by the seven. Yet we also live in a time of uncertainty, when the people cry out for justice and safety. Thus the faith militant, with the crown's approval, stands ready to protect the innocent. This day, before king and queen, the faith militant shall renew their vows of loyalty to the crown, to ensure unity under the seven's light." A ripple of murmurs flowed through the September. Cersei's face remained impassive. Tywin glanced at Margaery as though to remind her this had better go smoothly. Margaery looked toward the doors, where ranks of robed men filed in, staves and cudgels carried upright but not raised. They marched down the aisle. The High Septon beckoned them forward. The group reached the open space before the altar. Margaery recognized Lancel in their midst, along with other fervent faces. They bowed to the king and queen. The High Septon spread his arms wide. "Brothers, do you pledge to serve the king in the pursuit of justice and piety? Do you lay your weapons at his command, that the realm may know peace?" A tall man with a 7-pointed star etched into his breastplate stepped forward. He was older, calm in demeanor, a leading figure among the faith. "We do," he intoned, voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. "So long as the king's commands do not contradict the will of the Seven, we serve." Tywin's mouth tightened at the qualifier, but he said nothing. Tommen swallowed, stepping forward slightly. Margaery stood beside him, letting her presence radiate encouragement. The boy spoke carefully, as if reciting lines he had practiced. "I accept your fealty. May the Father guide me so I do not command anything unjust. Let us defend this city together." A hush lingered. The robed faithful knelt in unison, bowed their heads. The older knight placed his stave on the marble floor, an act mirrored by the others. "We swear it in the sight of the Seven." The High Septon raised his hands, calling for a prayer. "May this vow bind us all in harmony." The congregation whispered amens. Margaery exhaled, relief coursing through her that no radical had broken ranks to protest or hurl accusations. Lancel remained among them, gaze locked on the floor. For a moment, all was stillness and solemn unity. Then, from the back of the September, a voice cut through the hush, a raw shout. Heads turned. A lone zealot who had not knelt stepped forward. He wore the ragged robes of the lowest order of sparrows. His face was gaunt, eyes wild with fanatic light. "We do not kneel to mortal kings if they harbor sin in their midst," he cried, voice crackling with fervor. Tension snapped through the crowd. The older faith knight rose, glaring at the zealot. Margaery could see the man's hands shaking with adrenaline. She felt her heart pound, worried that one zealot might incite others to stand with him. The High Septon frowned. "Peace, brother. This is not the time for—" The zealot ignored him, pointing a trembling finger at Tommen. "The boy is surrounded by a nest of vipers. They feed him lies and consort with whores. They murdered the rightful king, Joffrey, and hide the truth. The Seven will not abide this mockery." An angry buzz stirred the crowd. Some courtiers looked frightened, others outraged. Cersei's eyes flared, and Tywin tensed, but they didn't speak for fear of inflaming the moment. Margaery moved closer to Tommen, anxious to shield him if the man did something rash. The older knight who led the faith militant said firmly, "This is blasphemy, brother. The king is anointed by the Seven. You dishonor the faith. Kneel now or face judgment." "I kneel only to the Father above," the zealot howled. Then, with startling swiftness, he lunged, pulling a small dagger from his sleeve and rushing toward the dais. Gasps rose from every corner of the September gold cloaks at the rear started forward, but the man's sudden movement was too quick. He darted up the steps toward Tommen, blade drawn. Margaery's instincts screamed. She grabbed Tommen's arm, trying to pull him back. Cersei let out a shriek. Tywin barked an order, but the zealot was feet away and closing fast. Swords rasped free from scabbards. Kingsguard knights were converging. At the last instant, a figure interposed. A faith militant brother, short staff in hand. It was Lancel. He surged forward, slamming the staff across the zealot's forearm. The dagger clattered to the floor, and the man stumbled. Lancel followed with a sharp strike to the zealot's midsection, sending him sprawling onto the marble. Two other faith militant men leapt in, pinning him down. A ripple of shock and relief pulsed through the crowd. Lancel knelt on the zealot's arm, breathing hard, then looked up at Tommen. "Forgive this man, your grace. He is lost in madness." Chaos erupted. Gold cloaks rushed forward, shouting for the man to be arrested. Cersei gathered Tommen in her arms, trembling with shock. Tywin demanded order, voice echoing off the walls. Margaery found herself clutching the dais rail, heart hammering. The entire wedding was a hair's breadth from becoming another blood-soaked tragedy. The High Septon stepped down, face grim. "Take that brother into custody. We shall not abide such violence in the House of the Seven." Several faith militant men hoisted the zealot to his feet. He struggled and spat, screaming condemnations of the crown as they dragged him away. Then the older knight turned to Tommen, knelt again and said fervently, "Our vow stands, your grace. We protect you from threats, even from our own ranks." Tommen, trembling but trying to be brave, gave a small nod. Margaery saw tears at the edge of his eyes. She wanted to comfort him, but there was no time. The High Septon hastily declared the oath-swearing complete and called for the congregation to disperse to the Red Keep for the wedding feast. Tense relief hung in the air. Everyone was eager to leave the place that had once again been stained by near violence. When the party regrouped outside, the atmosphere was subdued. The carriage ride back to the castle was far quieter than usual for a royal wedding. Margaery sat beside Tommen, holding his small hand, while Cersei seated across from them, eyes flicking between her son, Margaery, and the city beyond. Tywin rode in a separate carriage, presumably to maintain the image of calm. Once they reached the Red Keep, a lavish feast awaited in the throne room. Tables groaned with plates of roasted meats, fresh fish, sweet pastries, and exotic fruits. Minstrels played cheerful tunes, though it felt forced. Lords and ladies wore bright smiles tinged with unease. The memory of Joffrey's demise still lingered, and the near attack in the September only heightened everyone's nerves. Seated at the head table, Margaery did her best to appear gracious and unruffled, smiling at each well-wisher who came to congratulate the royal couple. She made sure Tommen had everything he wanted. He mostly picked at a small plate of honeyed duck, still shaken. Across the table, Cersei sipped wine endlessly, her face an unreadable mask. Tywin presided with a show of stern calm, occasionally rising to greet high lords. Olenna Tyrell and Mace Tyrell engaged guests with forced cheer. Halfway through the feast, the herald announced entertainment. A troupe of jugglers and dancers from Bravos. They tried their best to enliven the hall. Margaery clapped politely, but her gaze kept drifting to Tommen's face, drawn and anxious. She resolved to excuse them both early if the boy could not endure the entire feast. After the fiasco of Joffrey's wedding, she had no desire to push Tommen into another spectacle. Indeed, after an hour, Tommen leaned over, murmuring that he felt tired and unwell. Margaery glanced at Tywin, who nodded his permission. She stood, took Tommen's arm, and guided him from the throne room, ignoring the swirl of speculation as courtiers bowed or curtsied in their wake. The king was only a child. If he needed rest, no one could gainsay it. They made their way to Tommen's new chambers in Maegor's Holdfast, where he would reside as king. A pair of Kingsguards stood outside. Inside, the room was adorned with finery. Plush carpets, a sumptuous bed, a desk stacked with neat piles of parchment. A small table at the far side held Tommen's beloved kitten, Ser Pounce, dozing in a sunbeam. Tommen sank onto the bed, exhaustion weighing on him. Margaery sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly, worried that the near attack had left him more shaken than he showed. He shook his head. "Just frightened. That man wanted to kill me, didn't he? Because he thinks I'm sinful, or that I let sinful people near me." She smoothed his hair gently. "He was misguided. The faith militant themselves stopped him, so you can see that most of them stand with you. It's only a few who refuse to trust anyone." Tommen swallowed. "Why do they hate us?" She wished she could shield him from the ugly truth. That Joffrey's cruelty had sowed hatred, that Lannister misdeeds had fueled resentment, that the city was a tinderbox of misery. Instead, she said gently, "They've known hardship and believe the Seven's laws are not upheld. But you will be a just king, Tommen. You'll see that laws are fair and enforced properly, and that people are cared for. Then no one will have cause to hate you." He bit his lip. "But how? I'm only a boy. Grandfather Tywin makes the decisions, and Mother never listens to me. They're both so angry." Margaery's heart twinged with sympathy. "You'll learn. I'll help you, and in time you'll understand how to rule. But for now, rest. You've had a long day." She motioned for a servant to draw the curtains, dimming the room. Tommen managed a tiny smile, reaching out to pet Ser Pounce, who purred in response. Then he settled back against the cushions, eyelids fluttering, and soon he drifted towards sleep. Margaery watched over him, feeling more resolved than ever to shield him from the worst of King's Landing's machinations. A soft knock on the door made her stand. One of her ladies, Mira, peeked in. "Your Grace? The feast continues, but your Lord Father wondered if you might return. The guests are asking after you." Margaery hesitated, glancing at Tommen's sleeping form. "Let him rest," she whispered. "I'll return for a short while." She slipped out, crossing the threshold. In the corridor, she paused at the hush of footsteps. Cersei emerged from the shadows, gaze fixed on the chamber behind Margaery. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed with a mixture of anger and an emotion that might have been grief. "Your Grace," Margaery greeted calmly, stepping aside to let her approach her son's door. Cersei flicked her eyes at Margaery, then at the door. "He's all right," Margaery nodded. "He's exhausted, but safe." The day's excitement was too much for him. Cersei inhaled shakily, then turned that intense gaze on Margaery. If that zealot had reached him. "He did not," Margaery said softly. "The Faith themselves stopped him." Cersei's mouth twisted. "Yes, your precious Faith. A small portion of them saved him from the rest." "What a comfort." Margaery steadied her tone. "That was one rogue fanatic. The rest knelt. They pledged their loyalty. Surely you see that." For an instant, Cersei's mask cracked. Pain flickered across her features. "I see only that every corner of this realm is filled with knives waiting to strike my family. Joffrey is dead. My father lords over me, and now Tommen is in the hands of sycophants and zealots. And you, Margaery Tyrell, stand at the heart of it all, whispering in my son's ear." Margaery's voice caught. "I want the same thing you do. For Tommen to be safe and to grow into a king the people can love." Cersei laughed bitterly. "Loved kings are the easiest to kill. Fear is a safer shield. But you'll see in time if you survive that long." Then she turned and opened the door, slipping inside to watch over Tommen. Margaery stood in the corridor, breath trembling. She wondered if there was any chance of forging genuine peace with the Queen Dowager, or if one of them would have to break first. Steadying herself, she walked away, her footsteps echoing on the stone. The wedding feast beckoned, though her heart felt heavy. She was queen now, in name and vow, yet the realm teetered on a knife's edge. The next days would reveal whether the grand oath-swearing could truly bind the Faith Militant to the crown, or whether the fanatic who lunged at Tommen was merely the first drop of a coming storm. In the weeks ahead, Margaery redoubled her efforts to bring stability. She met with the High Septon daily, hammering out protocols so that the Faith Militant would coordinate with the Gold Cloaks. She arranged sessions where Tommen sat in judgment with representatives from both sides, hearing complaints about corrupt guards or violent sparrows. Bit by bit, an uneasy system of checks and balances formed. When a radical zealot stepped out of line, the older Faith Knights stepped in, reminding them of their vow to the king. When a Gold Cloak brutalized a suspect, the Faith demanded justice in open court. Tommen, with Margaery's discreet guidance, always tried to rule fairly, punishing wrongdoing on both sides. Slowly, the city calmed, yet Cersei's resentment simmered. She rarely confronted Margaery openly, but subtle slights occurred. A cancelled invitation. A rumor circulated that Margaery had bewitched Tommen with potions. Margaery ignored it as best she could, focusing on building alliances with the smaller houses around King's Landing and continuing her charitable works. Tywin watched it all from behind his unreadable mask, intervening only if a matter threatened the realm's stability. When the day came for Tyrion's departure to the Wall, it passed almost quietly. Escorted by a small retinue of black-cloaked brothers from the Night's Watch, who had come south to collect new recruits, and several gold cloaks, Tyrion rode out from the city in chains. Many watched from the ramparts, but there was no public spectacle. Margaery glimpsed him from a balcony. He looked up, spotted her, and gave a sardonic half-bow. She felt a shiver, wondering if, in some distant future, Tyrion Lannister might return to shape events yet again. As the weeks wore on, King's Landing resumed its rhythms. Markets bustled, ships filled the harbor, bread from Highgarden arrived regularly, gold and silver passed through the hands of merchants. The Faith Militant patrolled, the Gold Cloaks patrolled, and for a time, though tensions never vanished, bloodshed in the streets declined. Tommen grew a bit more confident, learning to read petitions and sign royal decrees, always turning to Margaery or Tywin for help. But fate in Westeros was never still. Whispers drifted from the north about battles near the wall. Rumors of dragons across the sea multiplied. Ravens arrived bearing tidings of ironborn raids on the western coasts, of lords uncertain where to pledge fealty. One evening, Margaery found herself alone in the Royal Solar, reviewing petitions. Tommen had gone to bed early, exhausted by a day of lessons. She set aside the parchment, rubbing her eyes, and stared into the flickering glow of a candle. She reflected on how she had seized King's Landing in the aftermath of Joffrey's death, forging an alliance with the Faith Militant that had checked the Lannisters' power. She had married Tommen, become queen in both name and influence. The city was hers to shape, at least in part. Yet she felt the weight of countless forces pressing in: Tywin's unwavering scrutiny, Cersei's hatred, the unpredictable zeal of the Faith, the shifting alliances of the great houses, and the uncertain threats beyond the horizon. She had accomplished much, but it was a precarious victory. Still, the alternative would have been to remain a pawn, overshadowed by Cersei, with no guarantee of safety or significance. Now she had the city's love, or enough of it to matter. She had the High Septon's ear. She had, for the moment, Tywin's grudging acceptance. And she had Tommen's trust, which blossomed into genuine affection. That was more power than most queens ever achieved. She rose and moved to the window. Outside, King's Landing spread out in twinkling lanterns, the dark shape of the great September's dome outlined against the night sky. Within that labyrinth of streets, men and women prayed for peace. Children fell asleep with full bellies for the first time in months, thanks to Tyrell grain. The Faith Militants strolled their routes, a vigilant presence that no longer openly clashed with the Gold Cloaks. For now, it was as if the city had accepted Margaery's balancing act: piety and power, bread and swords. She could almost imagine that the realm might know a lasting peace if she continued to pull the right levers. But she was not so naive to think she could control every factor. War in the north, the ambitions of Daenerys Targaryen, the cold cunning of Littlefinger, wherever he had slunk off to. All of those forces would converge eventually. And in King's Landing, alliances were built on quicksand. Tywin's tolerance for the Faith Militant might vanish if they threatened his authority. Cersei might launch a cunning plot to discredit Margaery. The small folk, so easily won over, could just as easily be turned by a different savior. The specter of wildfire slumbered beneath the city, a reminder that everything in King's Landing rested atop a hidden threat. Yet for this moment, with the hush of night cloaking the city and the gentle flicker of candlelight at her back, Margaery allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction. She had seized King's Landing without raising an army, using the power of faith and generosity to make the people hers. She had forced the Lannisters to compromise, forging a fragile peace that still held. In doing so, she had outmaneuvered the proudest house in Westeros. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new intrigues. But tonight, she allowed herself the faintest smile, gazing over the sleeping capital. The wind off Blackwater Bay rustled the curtains, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. Margaery Tyrell, now Margaery Baratheon, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, stood with her hands resting on the window ledge and closed her eyes, imagining a realm knitted together by careful diplomacy instead of torn by war. Whether such a dream could last, only the gods knew. Still, she whispered a thanks to the Seven for what she had accomplished so far. If cunning and a touch of mercy had brought her this far, they might carry her further yet. In a land where power was often seized by steel and terror, her victory, quiet, subtle, rooted in the people's love and the faith's zeal, was a new model of conquest. And so the city rested under the watch of a queen who had risen in the wake of Joffrey's death, weaving threads of faith, fear, and favor into a tapestry that clung to the throne. For now, at least, Margaery Tyrell held King's Landing. And if anyone could keep it from slipping back into darkness, it might just be the woman who had seized it without shedding a single drop of blood, only the poison in a golden chalice, a memory she and her grandmother would carry in silence all their days.